All right, so we're going to get the conclusion out of the way first. In my opinion, the Sony A1II is right now the best overall everything camera ever created as of today. That said, I do think it should and could have been way better. So last week I went to New York and I got to test out the A1II, and I felt like the entire time there were just two competing themes in my mind. So on one hand, it was the best camera I had ever used, and on the other, it felt like Sony kind of barely even tried when they created this. And I feel like, I definitely know that those shouldn't coexist. And yes, when I insinuate that a flagship $6,500 camera that shoots blackout-free 50 megapixel RAW files at 30 frames per second with 8K and 4K 120, when I insinuate that it's not good enough, I am beyond symptomatic for the worst possible form of gear acquisition syndrome that you could possibly have. So we're going to reconcile that with a question that I really wanted to answer for myself. Would I actually buy and recommend buying the A1 Mark II? So if you are familiar at all with Sony's cameras, essentially what Sony did is they took the new A9 III, which I do have a few videos out on already, but instead of using that sensor, which that camera has the full global shutter and everything like that, they instead took the sensor from the original A1, which is this camera right here. I've owned it for a few years now, and they threw this sensor basically in the A9 III and then called it the A1II. Now that in and of itself is not a bad thing, because the A9 III is Sony's best camera from a features and hardware perspective, and the A1 right now I think is probably the best sensor on the market, but they didn't do much of anything else. And given that this is Sony's flagship camera, it's more expensive than flagships from Canon and Nikon. It kind of feels like maybe they should have done a little bit more. And I did just get done testing the Canon R1, which introduced some pretty crazy new features. So with other cameras getting better, is Sony's method of just combining two different cameras together going to be good enough to make it a flagship beating camera? Now, I do have the A1II coming in very shortly, so a full review on this camera is going to be on the way. We'll take it out and do some really cool shoots. So if you haven't subscribed yet, definitely do it. But even though I've only had the camera, I guess, for about 24 hours in New York, as someone who has extensively used the A9 III and the A1, it really didn't take long for me to figure out that this kind of formula of hardware, features, and sensor is about as close to perfect as anyone has ever gotten before. Now, the hardware is going to be probably the biggest change to the A1II, and I know like the original A1 and the A1II look very similar to each other if you just look at them, but it is actually a pretty massive step up. Once you start shooting with the A1II and try to go back to an older camera like this, it's going to be tough. I promise you on that one. The biggest upgrade is actually probably going to be the 4-axis flip screen, which I've mentioned before in a video because it is also on the A7R5, which I have, and it's also on the A9 III. But this is absolutely my favorite screen mechanism of all time. I think the first camera to actually do this was Panasonic's G8-6, but essentially there is no position you can't yoga this screen into. And I shoot automotive, and there's just no way of getting, super low down vertical shots like this or high up shots like this without having a flip screen out. But when you're shooting landscapes, it is really nice to be able to have your screen kind of centered with the back of the viewfinder and not kind of way out here. So this is kind of the best of both. Plus, when you actually tuck this into the camera, you can't get it scratched at all, and it makes it so that you can access these ports without the screen getting in the way. Now, the buttons are also going to be much larger, and they just feel better. Plus, you get a new one up front, which we'll talk about in a second, but the grip has also been improved. The EVF is going to be better. Even the angle of the shutter button, it just kind of feels more ergonomic, and just overall, these might seem like small upgrades, but if you add them all up together, it really makes a big difference when you start to use this camera, to the point where once I purchased this A7R5, which has a lot of these upgrades on it, I almost never use my A1 anymore because it makes such a big difference on this. But none of this is revolutionary. Meanwhile, the Canon R1, which is $500 less, it feels more rugged. It has backlit buttons. It has this giant viewfinder that actually tracks your eyeballs. So you can literally move your focus point around just based on whatever you look at. And even though I way prefer how Sony's flip screen actually flips, the actual display on the Canon R1 and the Nikon Z9, they look better, and they actually seem brighter as well. But I'll definitely be putting them side by side in the full review. So again, subscribe and I'll compare those cameras a little bit more directly. Now, the features are also going to get a pretty big upgrade from the original A1 as well. Some of the biggest ones for me are going to be the upgraded IBIS system. So this is now going to work much better than before. So you get up to 8 stops of stabilization, just over 8 stops actually, in photo mode, but it's also going to be a big advantage for video as well. You will notice the upgrade on it. Another massive feature is going to be the pre-capture. So the camera is going to be constantly recording images, and then as soon as you hit the shutter, up to a second before you hit that shutter can be actually recorded to the camera at 30 frames per second. And again, like, this is a 50 megapixel raw file, so there is no quality hit here. And even cameras like the Canon R1, which do have this feature, it can only pre-capture up to a half a second before you actually hit the record button. So if you're shooting sports and wildlife, this could be a massive upgrade. This video is brought to you by Soundstripe, where you can find royalty-free music, sound effects, and video even faster with AI search powered by ChatGPT. Let me show you how this works. With AI search, you can just type in any information on the music you're looking for, whether it's a style of project, any mood, or important details. And when you find something you like, you can just add it to your playlist, add it to your favorites, find similar songs, or even download any additional stems right from the download page. But here's where it gets crazy. So let's say that song is great, but I want to customize it specifically for my project. This brand new feature will use the power of AI to analyze the track, break it into sections, and then you can pull from these sections to design your own fully custom mix that goes perfectly with your video. And with an optional Adobe Premiere integration tool, in just seconds, I can search and add additional music and sound effects directly to my timeline without ever having to leave my project. They also gave me a coupon code to get 10% off when you sign up today using the link in the description, so go ahead and check it out, and big thanks to Soundstripe for sponsoring this video. Now, the A1II can shoot 30 frames per second in RAW at the full 50 megapixels, just like the A1, which was unbelievably impressive when the A1 launched almost 4 years ago. But now you have cameras like the Canon R5II, which is actually back there on the shelf somewhere. That also shoots 30 frames per second at 45 megapixels, and it's almost $2,500 less. Plus, if you don't mind dropping down to 24 megapixels, you have the Canon R1, which shoots 40 frames per second, and you have Sony's A1II with a global shutter that shoots 120 frames per second, which is just insane. And again, like, Sony's still the fastest for a high-resolution sensor. It's just no longer like the standout feature that it was 4 years ago. In 2021, like, nothing was even close to this camera. The A1 was just so far ahead of anything else. It was absolutely crazy. But now you have this growing number of fast action cameras, and there's just a lot of good options for you. But the A1II does have a feature that Sony introed with the A9III that actually makes this a little bit more useful. So now you can actually map that new custom button. You can actually map any button, I think, to this. But when you're doing that, you can actually trigger it to switch frame rate. So you could be shooting at 5 frames per second, hit that button, and then it'll go into 30 frames per second, which is really awesome for quick bursts. And it just makes having these much faster frame rates, I think, a lot more useful. And Sony has been making some big leaps in technology and upgrades over the years on its lenses to really help autofocus keep up with these crazy fast frame rates. So I think that combination is still going to be pretty solid. And that's going to be another big upgrade. So the A1II is now using Sony's latest autofocus system. In the entire system, it just feels so much faster than the original A1. It is more intelligent. You get a new extra large and extra small autofocus point to pick from. And then it also gets another upgrade I've been requesting for a while. So when Sony first introduced this new AI autofocus system, which I think was in the A7R5, it's an amazing system and allows you to basically select a subject, and then the camera can find that subject with just so much more detail than before. So for example, it's not just tracking a person's eye, it's actually following their entire body and face to predict where the eye should be and set the autofocus point there. But at the time, I said it didn't feel very AI because in order to get it to work, you actually had to tell it what subject you were trying to take a picture of. And then remember to change it when you wanted to go from like taking a picture of a dog to taking a picture of your kids. But now the camera has an auto mode that can actually automatically identify the subject for you. And even if you have like a person with sunglasses or if they turn away from you, the camera still knows exactly where their eyes should be. Although I did find the A1II, when it started to lose a subject, sometimes it didn't want to reconnect to that subject immediately. And this is something I have not seen or noticed on my A7R5, which also has this AI processor to it. So it could have just been like a pre-production firmware type issue, but it did struggle a few times. So I definitely want to test this out. And overall, the system is really advanced. And if you're coming from a Sony A1 or kind of Sony's older cameras, it's going to be a pretty big upgrade. But keep in mind, like Canon has had this automatic subject detection for a few years. Their AI autofocus can actually recognize not just people, but the action of sports like soccer. So the autofocus point isn't just detecting a person. It can actually jump to wherever the camera thinks the play or the action is happening and then focus on a person there. Again, like the A1II is a major step up from the A1, and it's an absolutely amazing autofocus system. So like, I don't want to diminish this at all, but it doesn't feel as revolutionary as it used to. Now, video has always been one of my favorite things about the original A1. It's one thing to be able to find a stills camera that can shoot 50 megapixels at 30 frames per second with zero viewfinder blackout and almost no rolling shutter. It's another thing when that same camera also shoots 8K video and 4K 120, all in 10-bit 422. The A1 is just really a true hybrid photo video camera that is so good it is tough to find a dedicated video camera that can actually match these specs. And now the A1II is basically giving you all of that same ability, but now you get it combined with the improved hardware. So that 4-axis flip screen that doesn't block your ports. You have a much better IBIS system. You have the focus system upgrades that also work for video as well. You have Sony's latest menu system, which is actually great for video. It's a big upgrade in that regard. Plus, they've added a few features like the ability to import your own LUTs. Like now you can shoot ProRes RAW over HDMI to an external recorder. But unfortunately, all of the limitations or just shortcomings on the original A1 are going to be still here as well. Not a whole lot is changing. So you don't have any custom aspect ratios. There's no like open gate recording. You do have a small crop when you're in 4K 120. Somehow the Sony A9 III was able to get rid of this crop in 4K 20, but not this camera. Now that one's not too big of a deal to me, but I do think this combination of hardware features and quality is going to make this Sony A1II one of the best cameras overall, like anywhere, to be able to shoot video, period. But it doesn't level things up beyond that. So there's no internal raw recording like there is on like the R1 and the Z9, Canon's R5 II as well. There's no 8K60 like those cameras either. There's no ProRes options. There's no announcement to any active cooling. So there might be overheating issues if you're in direct sunlight, like I noticed on my original A1. So given how much better that other cameras have gotten with their video specs over the last few years, like the Z8 and R5 II, that can both shoot 8K 60 and 4K 120 and cost over $2,000 less. So as amazing as this new one is, the A1 series has gone from just being on another level good to just being one of the best. And I know it's a little weird that we're this far into a camera video and I haven't even mentioned image quality, but we did get to shoot with it, and my wife Sally got some amazing portraits with it, and I'll break down quality a little bit more in the full review. But this is the same sensor as the original A1, so essentially no meaningful change to image quality. But it's still great. Like, this is a backside illuminated stacked CMOS sensor with 50 megapixels, fast readout speeds, and it's still really solid in low light. I just can't be the only one that's at least a little disappointed that we haven't really seen an image quality bump in cameras since the A7R II over 9 years ago. And I really thought in the 4 years since the original A1, we would see either like an IQ bump or at least like faster frame rates and readout speeds. But this is still going to be one of the highest quality cameras that you can buy, plus it's high resolution and it's crazy fast and it has amazing autofocus and new hardware. So In a couple weeks, I'm going to get over this kind of initial letdown. I still think the A1II is going to be the closest we've ever been to a perfect camera. It really does just about everything well, and it does it without any real weaknesses, which is even more rare. But while the original A1 it was miles ahead of the competition, even though it's pretty crazy expensive, especially for what I would call somewhat average hardware, there was just no other camera that could do what this could do. And so that made it feel worthy. And with the A1II hitting shelves as a 2025 camera, it no longer feels like that same class leader that it once was. You now have options. You have some really good options, actually, and you have some much cheaper options with cameras like the R5 II. But the more time I spent using the A1II, the more I just felt like it is still going to be the best overall camera you can buy today. Essentially, it does exactly what it should do. It took the best hardware, the best features Sony had, and probably their best sensor, and combined them into a single camera that, yeah, I actually would buy. So hit me up in the comments, though, because I'm really curious your thoughts on this one. I should have the camera next week, so let me know everything that I should be testing on this. I'm going to be posting a bunch of BTS as well over on IG, so tons going on there. I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me, and I'll catch you soon in the next one.